Welcome to the April edition of the Cerini Nonprofit Connection. Today's guest is Mark Gajowski. Mark is the founder of Magii Pension Services. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, thanks for having me, man.
So before we get started, why don't you talk a little bit about what you do for the nonprofit sector and how you work with the sector itself?
Great. Thanks for asking. So, of course, thanks for everything you guys do at Cerini, for everything in the non-for-profit world, just making Long Island a better place.
We try.
Yeah, well, you guys do a great job at it. So for the last 19 years, myself and my team in Hauppauge have had the distinct pleasure of working with many non-for-profits, several hundred, specifically around the retirement area, trying to help them recruit and retain their staff by using retirement plans. Generally speaking, and you know this, non-for-profits can't afford to pay much in terms of traditional wages, so they tend to be a little bit more benefit generous, and retirement plans tend to be one of those areas.
Okay, very cool. In terms of the retirement plans, you just set up retirement plans for them. I'm assuming there are a bunch of different types of retirement plans that you can kind of establish for them.
Lots of fun retirement plans. Yep. So it's good for Jeopardy trivia in terms of the ERISA numbers in terms of them. But yeah, so traditionally not-for-profits can have lots of different types of retirement plans. And yes, we do everything from the setup, the installation, the ongoing maintenance, and the brokerage services for them.
Okay, so what do you see as maybe some of the key plan ideas that nonprofit organizations should be looking at?
You mean like a top five plan?
Yeah,
ideas?
let's go.
Let's go with top five. Thank you.
Top five.
You know I wanted that drum.
Of course you did.
Yeah, I had the Tonight Show in my head, but that's fine. So top five, right? So in no particular order, but we'll go with it. So number five was essentially running an RFP benchmark. I think.
Okay.
So bottom up. So
okay. We'll get deeper into these after you kind of throw out your list.
Ladle out to five first. Okay.
Yeah.
So running a retirement planning benchmark.
Okay.
I'm looking at your list. Optimizing retirement plan design. Mine's got the notes on it. Education policy. Thank you. You almost think I prepared for this. Education policy statements, or EPSs for short, or jargon.
Okay.
Investment policy statements, and last but not least, this is the drum roll.
Oh, sorry.
Big drum roll. Thank you. We should have practiced that. Fiduciary acknowledgement and ownership. Yes, outsourcing. Fiduciary being very important with fiduciary.
Okay. So kind of let's talk about some of those five concepts that you brought up. Let's start with benchmarking. I know you said, RFP process and benchmarking. What is that and why is that important?
Mm-hmm. So in a retirement planning space, right, which ties everything into the number one, which is being a fiduciary. So as a fiduciary, it just means ultimately you're responsible for the retirement plan and all the things in it, whether you acknowledge them or not.
All right, so I'm going to cut you off right there.
Yep,
so who within a retirement plan actually is the fiduciary? Sure. I mean, is that normally when you think about a fiduciary and you're working with a investment person or someone, are they the fiduciary? Are you the fiduciary? Who's the fiduciary in a plan?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So we're taking it that way. So essentially anyone that's going to touch the plan, have maintenance on the plan, be a named person in the document. So generally speaking, it could be an executive director if we're talking non-for-profit nomenclature. For-profit would be like the president or the founder of an organization.
Okay.
But it could be someone that works for you that's remitting the money to the plan custodian, right? Who's holding the assets.
So you're talking about maybe someone in HR
Sure.
who's kind of dealing with, and maybe even the CFO who's signing the checks.
Oftentimes people get very confused and don't realize that someone who's being assigned a task for the company that they work for is essentially going to have fiduciary roles and responsibilities. And the reason it matters so much, right? In addition to their investment advisors outside, the third-party administrator that they work with and others, or that this fiduciary term and title has personal financial liability now, which is a big deal.
Okay.
There's been a lot of litigation around that.
Okay. So when you say, so you think you're out there doing a job and all of a sudden you could be personally responsible for doing it?
Yeah. So it matters a lot for, I think, especially the non-for-profits or nonprofit sector. She said, "Don't clear your voice. Got to drink the water, man." So in terms of, being a fiduciary and making it important. So you're out there trying to do the right thing, right? Make Long Island a better place. You change the world, do good things. Or in a for-profit, you're trying to run a business every day. You have a retirement plan for your staff and you think you're outsourcing it to all these people. Right? I got a broker I can trust. I think I'm with a big name firm. And I hired my staff person to remit the money, and the money goes in, and once a year we have an enrollment meeting. You don't realize that there's several hundred tasks that are all considered fiduciary tasks that most people just don't even think about. I always used it as an iceberg analogy. You like this analogy?
Go for it. Let's hear it. I like icebergs.
Yeah, we're going to have to expound on that belly button theory later. But the iceberg analogy is that 10% of the things that people think about lie above the waterline, just like an iceberg, whereas 90% of the liability lies below, which you don't see, which is all the little things, the notices and things like, going back to number five, running a benchmark or an RFP.
And no nonprofit organization wants to be the Titanic.
Well, you definitely don't want to have bad press,
Right.
right? There's no reason to have that, especially when you have firms like you or someone like us telling you, hey, you need to do this. It's not that daunting of a task. And if you haven't done it, you really should.
Okay, so we'll get back to fiduciary and mitigating risk in a little while. Since you keep going back to that running the RFP benchmark, why don't you talk a little bit about what that does and how that kind of helps an organization maybe defer some of their risk or allay some of their risk?
Certainly. So first, I'm using two titles, right, which are not synonymous. So they're not exactly the same.
Okay.
So an RFP is going to be much deeper than a benchmark. So benchmark is this, right? So if I'm 6 feet tall and you're 6 feet tall and both males and we're both born the same year, our benchmark weight would be, we should be a certain weight, right?
Okay.
We should be 185 pounds. If we're any more or less than that, I know, right? Got to stop working out. If you're any more or less than that, then maybe you weigh too much, you're too thin, right? But it has nothing to do with who you are as a person and what you eat or anything specific to you, right? So a benchmark is just that. It's a ballpark of where you should be. Benchmarking for retirement plans could be something as specific as, hey, we're a nonprofit on Long Island. We have 100 employees and $10 million in our plan. And the benchmark is going to compare you against other nonprofits that have a similar type of asset size and a similar body count.
So what sort of things are you looking to benchmark in order to ensure that you do an appropriate benchmark?
Right. So benchmarking is helpful because at least it's more information than you had before, right? So I always say, like, if it's someone that works out every day, they wake up, the first things they do is they weigh themselves every day, right? So that's your benchmark, right? You're weighing yourself. It means nothing because you could weigh yourself if you're a professional power lifter. You could be 200 pounds, but only 5'5". So if you go to your doctor's going to say you're morbidly obese because for your height, your weight is way off. Has nothing to do with the fact you're in perfect health otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. That's a benchmark. So it's not particular to you, which is why an RFP is a little bit deeper.
So from a nonprofit perspective, there's no specific benchmarks you should be measuring?
So we can talk generally.
Go ahead,
right? So you should absolutely get a benchmark done because it's better than having nothing done, right? Okay. And in general, you should have a benchmark that is done to perform for the basic things. Make sure that your plan has a diversified fund menu, what the average costs are in your plan, and whether you're doing a match or not a match, and whether or not your match is right or wrong for the average industry and the average size plan. Again, not specific.
Okay. And then let's talk about then the RFP. So then I assume that the RFP is something more in-depth than a benchmark.
Yeah, so an RFP is substantially more in-depth. When I say substantially more in-depth, normally that scares most people away. Oh, that means I've got to get you a lot of stuff. Most of the stuff is readily available. And again, you're a fiduciary, supposed to have access to it anyway, in case the DOL or IRS comes knocking at your door and asks for it.
Okay.
So it's your plan document, which is the governing instrument of your plan. It's your census, which is information on your staff, right? Age, dates of birth, dates of hire, income, etc. Relatively easy information to pull since you have a payroll company. That's a quick export.
Okay.
And then it's plan-specific information. And then, of course, some dialogue around, hey, why did you have this? Hey, Ken, why did you build this plan this way? How long have you had it this way? Do you realize it says you have a match, but you haven't done a match, etc.? So now it's specific stuff on your specific plan to say, with those specific ideas in mind, where do you really match up now versus something else specific? So you can pull it apart to put it back together better.
Okay, so when we look at this and we talk about a benchmark or RFP process, let's go more towards the RFP since that seems to be the more detailed of the processes. Why do I need to do this? What does it do for me? I mean, it's great to know, hey, look, here's how I compare to industry standards, or here's how I compare to myself, but what am I doing with this information?
Yeah, so that's good. So again, a benchmark is stepping on a scale. An RFP is going through the height, weight, blood test, analyzing what you eat, how often you eat, how often you exercise, et cetera. Substantially better outcome when you get more details. The reason you have to do is because you're a plan fiduciary and you're supposed to be doing it. So a typical rule of thumb would be about once every 3 years, you should go through the process, at least a benchmark, because it's pretty quick and easy. But an RFP is also, to be fair, pretty quick and easy because really the consulting firm you're working with should be able to run that stuff with very little input and need and draw from the nonprofit.
Okay, so if a nonprofit is putting together a to-do list, the first thing they should be putting on their to-do list is every 3 years have a benchmark or an RFP done.
Yeah, get it done. Get it done, stick it in the file to at least show yourself and your board, hey, we're doing the right thing here. We're trying to make sure that we're compliant. It's better to have something than nothing.
You mentioned, I know we'll go over some of the other things, but you just mentioned now, for your board. What I find a lot of times is that there's very little communication between the organization and the board regarding pension plans. They talk about a bunch of other things, but there never seems to be that communication with the board of directors with respect to pension plans. What sort of information should you be bringing to your board of directors on a regular basis so that your board understands, what's happening within the pension plan, and should the board be concerned about the pension plan?
Yeah, well, yes, the board should absolutely be concerned with the pension plan, because your pension plan, retirement plan, right, sort of synonymous terms there. Even though traditionally pension means employer contribution only, versus a retirement plan, which could be employer and employee both sharing, right? So deferring money in a match. It should be part of the compensation discussion with your board, right? So hey, as part of our allocation of the limited resources that typically nonprofits have, how are we reallocating this money? What are we putting towards wages? What are we putting towards internal culture? What are we putting towards the health insurance and or contribution? What are we putting towards the retirement plan?
Okay.
So that retirement plan piece probably should be broken out, just like the major medical probably is, in terms of this is why we have it, this is what we're doing, this is where we benchmark or RFP ourselves at least once every 3 years, do that process.
So the board really should understand where we are in the process and understand fiduciary responsibilities and all that other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you know this because you guys do a great job of educating boards in terms of how to be a good board member and make sure that you're doing the right thing. Boards are ultimately responsible for making sure that nonprofits doing the right thing.
Okay. So one of the other things you mentioned in your top 5 list was you talked about the optimizing plan design. Why don't you talk a little bit about how an organization can optimize its plan design? I mean, obviously, every single organization is different, as you said before, and every single organization has different goals that they were trying to accomplish. How can I use a plan to accomplish those goals?
Yeah. So it's often not understood that plan design, selfishly as a third-party administrator, I think retirement plan design is the cat's meow.
Cat's meow. What does that even mean?
Cat's pajamas. No, it's the coolest thing.
Next okay,
like sliced bread.
I get it now. Okay.
Wow.
Jeez, I thought we were on the same dude, you're old.
Yeah, totally old. This is the shout out for our event. We're going to talk a lot more about plan design on May 10th, right, at Capital One in Melville. Registration's open soon, I think, for that.
Yeah, it's open now. So what Mark is talking about is after today, we're going to kind of bring the band back together, and we're going to be doing a presentation on March 10th over at the Capital One building in Walton Road. In Melville, and that's going to be a Thursday from 8 to 10:30.
You're still dressing like the Blues Brothers, right?
Yeah, we are. Do you have your hat?
I do.
Okay, cool.
Yep, and the shades.
Nice.
So back to retirement plan design and optimizing. So there's a lot of different ways to peel back the orange and make sure that your retirement plan is recruiting staff in, right? Hey, maybe it's that the organization is going to give a match. And you don't want to just give matches away or contribution away to your staff.
You want to give lighters, not matches.
That'd be pretty cool too, right? Depends on the music that's on. But in terms of giving that match and that contribution, you want to make sure that that's also being retained by them, right? So that you're not just giving money away to get people to join you, but that maybe you're enticing them to stay by vesting them over a period of time, that they're earning into that benefit. And there's different types of plans.
So you can really use your plan design to establish goals within your organization. I know we've seen some organizations where they've needed to direct funds to a certain funding source. And they were able to use a pension plan to do that because they added provisions within their pension plan that allowed for that to happen.
Yeah,
absolutely. So there are a lot of really cool things that you can do with a pension plan, and it's not just, yes, it's great to take care of your employees, but there are other things outside of taking care of your employees that you can kind of do with a pension plan. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. Also for those key staffs, right, for nonprofits. So maybe you're setting up a deferred comp to entice some key folks to stay, and putting a separate plan provision in place for them for that. So, outside of just the traditional run-of-the-mill, if you will, plans that are focused on staff of all sorts, maybe you're exclusively benefiting a certain type, which isn't always common in nonprofits, but is not of course mutually exclusive to the for-profit world.
Yeah. Okay. One of the other things you talked about is you talked about some of the policies or policy statements and stuff that nonprofits should be setting up. So you talked about an education policy statement. You want to talk a little bit about what an education policy statement is and why it's important?
To me, that's the most fun, especially in the nonprofit world, because now you're coming up with a plan, which could be anything really, which is how are we getting access to your staff, right? When I say we, I'm talking on behalf of the organization. How are you best putting forward in terms of here's why this organization, fill in the blank, nonprofit has this great retirement plan that we spent all this time benchmarking and designing properly. Here's how we're going to educate you, not just upfront, but on an ongoing basis. And keeping people informed is really important. I mean, selfishly for us, being in the business at 20 years, financial literacy is very low. I'm always surprised to see how little basic knowledge most folks in general have not just in life on finance, but specific to retirement plans. They don't know what they don't know. If they're not educated by their employer, maybe they're never getting that at home, or they don't have a personal advisor because they don't make a lot of wage, maybe they don't have someone that they can go back to. So if they're not getting it at the employer, where are they going to get it from?
So one of the things you talk about is that they should do this, but is there any legal requirements for an organization to educate its staff?
There is, on a very basic level. And when I say very basic level, so once a year, once every 12 months, whether it's a fiscal or calendar, you're supposed to have access to your staff, come in with some professional advisor who may just sit down or do a big group meeting and say, this is your retirement plan, this is how it works, here's some provisions and whatnot. Typically, however, that's not your best benefit because you're really not getting the best education. You're talking very high level. And if someone's not ready to retire or they haven't put money into the plan, it means nothing to them. You haven't enticed them in any way of why it's important to save.
Okay, so going back to that little checklist for nonprofit organizations, so another thing they should be adding on to that to-do list is make sure that at least on an annual basis, if they want to do the minimum, they bring somebody in, but they really should be doing a lot more than just the minimum.
I mean, people are totally connected to their mobile devices now, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of ways, depending on who you're working with, in terms of who's physically holding the assets in your plan, that they can put smart apps on their phone. You can push out cool little, 45-second vignettes. Hey, this is why it's really important to stay invested in the plan. Or, hey, it's January. Most people just got some maybe increase. Maybe here's the reason why you should take 10% of your increase and put it towards your retirement plan. And this is what it looks like over a period of time. Because people don't think like that. And I get it. It's expensive to live on that.
So you talked about, increasing fiscal literacy. I mean, is that something that you're seeing happening out there in the marketplace a little more than you have in the past? I mean, it's funny because I had a nonprofit client reach out to me. First time it's ever happened where someone said, hey, can you help me write a fiscal literacy policy?
So there's actually this organization I mentioned to you now. So it's the National Endowment for Financial Education, NEFE. Which essentially was started out of the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards. So it's a nonprofit organization that only their sole goal essentially is to, without any kind of PAC money behind it, push out financial literacy purely and specifically for people who are just not getting it anywhere else, either because it's not taught in schools, it's not taught at home, and they don't get it a lot of times from work. So unfortunately, I've still not seen a huge increase in terms of general financial literacy, even though education policy statements is now not such a foreign term. And I didn't coin that phrase, somebody else did, but I just like the phrase EPS, just sounds snazzy.
Cool. Is that something that you do with your clients in terms of kind of going in on a regular basis and educating their staff?
Yeah, so I mean, part of what a good advisor should be doing for their clients, which is one of those other things where you could add to that arbitrary checklist, is most of the time, most people think they have a great plan, right? Because nothing's wrong and they haven't gotten the knock on the door from the Department of Labor or the IRS. But what's being said is, how often are you sitting with your consultant and going over your plan design provisions? How often are you going through how many assets do you have?
You just told me to write provisions down, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, so you write that, which is fantastic. So you're taking notes. That's good. I like that.
Oh, I wrote it before you said it. So I actually knew you were going there.
You go. It's because we're like this from the womb.
From the womb.
So I still like the Blues Brothers thing. I'm going to go with that. Maybe. So another throw. So with that, you should be having that annual review, right, from a consultant, going through everything, the plan, education, how often are we getting in front of your staff, how often you do it, what's the best way to reach your staff. Sometimes in different organizations, it's just impossible because we have short cycles and seasons with every client. Let's say we have a client out east and for whatever reason, they're extremely busy during the summer. So you can't get them during the summer. So for 4 or 5 months, they're just MIA. You can't touch them at all. Does that mean that their employees are not important enough to continue to push out to them education on their plan?
We can do like little webinars on an intranet or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And lots of people do lots of different things. So a lot of our charter schools, for example, a lot of those charter school clients, which we've had since about 2000, and I've probably advised several hundred charter schools in the 19 years that I've been working with charter schools. They're probably the most progressive group that we have.
That was a group that actually reached out to me and asked for. Yep.
Because they just tend to be more progressive, because they're thinking outside the box generally, right? Because they're not with the traditional system, right? They're not working with the man. They're cutting things very different, and because they want access to their staff very differently. They realize their staff's young on average, mostly single, mostly female. I'm just using a cross section of most charter schools. They know they need to get in front of them on a constant basis. These people went to school to help change young lives. They didn't go to school to learn finance.
Okay. One of the things you talked about, and I actually, like I said, wrote it down, provisions. Another thing, if nonprofits are putting together their to-do list, some of the things that we find a lot is when you go through your plan design, there's a lot of situations that come into play where nonprofits aren't necessarily thinking about how they can create a better plan design, and how they can take care of their staff better by just adding provisions within their plan. Things like automatic enrollment, or things like
Auto escalation.
Yep, auto escalation, or the investment choice where it's automatically put into a certain investment choices rather than going into a money market account.
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit about some of those types of things.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the things which we're talking about, it's amazing to me still as we start to do more and more analysis of these nonprofits or just even for-profit organizations as well. Even things like Roths. Roths are still not, used widely across plans. I don't know. There's no reason not to add a Roth 401k to a provision.
You want to just give a 2-second synopsis of what's the difference between a traditional and a Roth is?
Right. So traditional is a traditional deduction. So you take money off an employee's payroll and they're putting it into the retirement plan, hoping that whatever investments are compounding tax-free over time, when they retire, it comes out as ordinary income because they've got the tax break up front, traditional.
So what you're saying is they get a deferral of the tax until they ultimately take the money.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Whereas a Roth, Roth 401k, Roth 403b, completely different, right? You're paying the tax today. So most people say, well, why would I pay the tax today and put it in the plan? Well, because A, you're not subject to a minimum distribution in the future. B, that money's compounding for the same 25, 30, 40 years if someone's really young or more. And that money compounding over time comes out with no tax due. So
you never pay tax on the growth. So in the first one, traditional, you're deferring and you pay tax on the growth. And on a Roth, you don't defer, but you never have to pay tax on the income that comes off it.
And there's no income limit when you had a Roth 401k or 403b provision. So otherwise, most people are income capped, especially on the island. They just make too much to be able to contribute to a Roth. And that's one of those provisions like you were talking about. Roth, auto escalation, which is automatically increasing someone's contribution if they're already contributing into the plan by a certain percentage every year.
Okay.
Auto enrollment, which is, hi, welcome to working at Cerini and Associates. We believe so much in the value of retirement that we're automatically going to take 2% of your wage off and put it to your plan unless you opt out. It's called a negative election. And what you find is most people will automatically just go with whatever you think. So it's amazing what happens when you make a decision for someone. Most people just are so either not literal in understanding how this thing works. Why would I be involved in it? If they can't see that 2% more in my paycheck is not making me live any better, which means I'm also not living any less by putting that money into the plan and compounding it. So negative election works great.
Yeah, there's also the provision where you can push people who no longer work for you out of the plan, which is, I think, is an important provision too, because
Cleaning it up.
Once you get over a certain number of employees, you need to have an audit of your pension plan, and nobody really wants to go through another audit.
They definitely don't want to go through an audit. A lot of our CPA colleagues. It is. You like that?
Very
right?
subtle.
That was good, but it is good business to periodically go through and make sure that the people who are off your plan are done and pushed out, if you will. I like the term pushed out. It's kind of nice. You mentioned that. That's one of those things that we do on an ongoing basis. I would totally encourage plan sponsors, people who are sponsoring plans, to make sure that that's on their checklist too. Hey, when I'm having these conversations with our consultants, how can I get some of these people who have now left our employment for whatever reason out of the plan? Because as a fiduciary, I owe them the same responsibility that I do whether they work for me or if they don't work for me. The Department of Labor does not know any difference between participant and employee.
Right.
If they're in your plan, they're in your plan. It has nothing to do with whether they're working for you or not.
Right. So they're creating more risk by being there. They're costing you typically more money, and they could expose you to
liability. Sure.
Yep.
Yeah. There's no love there anymore, right? So they can clearly complain about everything. Hey, why am I in this fund versus that fund? Hey, our S&P 500 fund is 8 basis points more expensive than it should be. I know, some crazy number, right? It doesn't have to be real to still be a pain in your keister.
So, kind of along
keister,
keister,
right?
you can say
I said
keister,
it 3 times now.
You can also say butt.
Yep.
Yeah. But along that same line, one of the things that you've seen in the for-profit world, and it started to kind of push into the nonprofit world, is these lawsuits. You want to talk a little bit about what you've seen out there from a lawsuit perspective, because as you said earlier, nonprofits are putting together these pension plans, putting them out there to kind of help their employees, trying to be nice guys.
Do the right thing. Yeah.
And, that could
And you're exposing yourself to, what they say, never expose yourself, right? At least to liability.
Really? I'm not supposed to?
Not supposed to. Legally, I think.
I learn something every day.
Well, write that down. That should be on the notepad. So
don't
expose
myself. Okay, got it.
So by doing this, right, and trying to have a good plan and running everything right and benchmarking, all these right things that you can do, unfortunately, that's part of the game. And you have staff and employees is you're at risk of something. So we're trying to help people do it right? Here's the right way of keeping yourself out. But people are always confused to think that I have to have a really big plan or I have to have a lot of staff to be a risk. I always say that nonprofits in particular are at higher risk anyway, because you're subject to really bad press if something comes out. Again, it doesn't have to be real to be bad. Yeah. So what does that mean? Well, that means you could have a couple $1 million in your plan, which is not a lot of money in a retirement plan, to have someone go to the Department of Labor and make some big heck of a problem for you. And they can come in and all kinds of challenges. Maybe you didn't have a qualified default investment vehicle, like a target date fund, which is very common. That gets back to those plan provisions. Maybe you never educated them on an ongoing basis. Maybe there was notices that weren't made. Maybe loans were taken and never paid back. So a whole bunch of things that can cause some problems for your plan. The biggest of which being that they could disqualify your plan, and then all that money gets unwound, and there's a big tax liability for that.
Yeah. And what I also started to say before, the lawsuits. I mean, there have been some universities that have been sued by their employees because the employees felt that the plan wasn't doing the right thing for them.
Yep. And actually the NYU one, which is probably the most common one I think that's out there in the press, where NYU had a whole bunch of issues that they were perceived to have done wrong. And good case in point, some colleagues of ours at Nixon Peabody have actually done some documentation work on this that we sat through in December, and they actually talked right through the entire process of what they did right, where they could have done things a little bit better, but thankfully NYU came out unscathed and a little bit learned for it, and we'll all benefit by that process. But again, it didn't have to be real since they were not smacked on the hand. It was just, here's what happened. It was one of the first times that ERISA actually opened up the floodgates of 403Bs to the same sort of things that 401Ks have been dealing with for years.
Yeah, one of the provisions, I don't know if it was in that lawsuit or another one, the complaint was there were too many investment options, and the employees were paralyzed because they didn't know what choices to make. And this comes back to your education and the need for the education.
It's also education. It's not just for the staff, right? So sometimes it's education for the board members too, or the important folks that are at that organization that are limiting the options or picking the plan. Sometimes people think if you just put a lot of options together, then hey, I'm covered, I'm protected because I put a whole lot of options together. Yeah, but what chose those options? How did you educate the staff on those options, right? Did they really understand what they're talking about? I'll tell you, sometimes people put things like target dates in there, which are great options, right? Qualified options. Just by offering them and letting employees default to them, you're taking some risk off the plate there too. But what some employees do is try to outsmart it, right? So let's say I'm going to retire in 2040. Well, I'm not going to put part of my money in the 2040 fund, the 2030 fund, the 2020 fund, and because I'm now defeating the point of trying to use one fund to solve my retirement mix.
Yep.
People don't know.
One of the other things that, and we were talking about, earlier, you were saying there's all these different things you need to talk to your broker about or talk to your administrator about. One of the things that you didn't, or maybe you did, but I didn't hear, was even looking at some of the specific investments that are within the fund, because, if a investment is underperforming, you can run into problems because if you're not reviewing those investments and making sure that those investments are performing appropriately, that could be a risk also.
And most people think when they have a plan that their broker, their advisor is doing all that due diligence. And I'll tell you, most of the time, the firms that they work for will not allow those brokers to do that because you need to wear a certain hat to do that. When I say hat, they're not physically wearing a hat, but it's title. And the title is a 330.
Wait, I just want to make sure. When you said then hat, when we do the Blues Brothers, were you also figuratively saying that, or that's literally? So that's a literal. Okay, just want to make sure.
That's May 10th.
May 10th.
I like you keep throwing that out. So Capital One, free breakfast, Cannon Mark Live. But the hat, that title that they're wearing is a 338 co-investment fiduciary, which is very common. But that's them actually going through and recommending and physically selecting and moving the funds to not always necessarily cheaper funds, but maybe better performing funds, right? So as we know, price is always the issue in the absence of value. No one says you have to pick the lowest cost option, but you have to have a reason if something costs more. Well, maybe it costs more because it's performing better. That's a reasonable assumption. But you're absolutely right. And the investments sometimes are what most people spend most of the time on. That's that. I love that iceberg analogy. That's 10%, right? That's right there in front of you. It's on your statements all the time. It's what people talk about. Hey, do you not have a really low cost option fund? Maybe you should. Who's picking them? Who's monitoring them?
Right.
So you can outsource some of your fiduciary responsibilities, right? Which in and of itself is a fiduciary task. So just to clarify, just because you hired someone that's wearing a fiduciary hat for your plan doesn't mean that you're totally removed from doing it, because you hired them. You're ultimately responsible for making sure they're doing their job.
Okay, so let's talk about this whole fiduciary thing. And if I am a fiduciary, how do I limit my risk as that fiduciary? What should I be doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think numbers 5 through 2 helps in some of that, right? So, running a RFP benchmark, right? Putting together an investment policy statement, an education policy statement, making sure the designs are appropriate, talking about the investments, right? So that's clearly going to cover a lot of the big items. But your fiduciary tasks are a finite number of tasks. It's a lot of tasks, 200 some tasks to be specific, but you can outsource some of those things. So part of limiting it is acknowledging the fact that you are in fact a fiduciary. They say acknowledgement is the first step.
Welcome to meet you. Nice to meet you. I'm a fiduciary.
Yes, hey, love that. Me too.
That's the first of the 12 steps, right?
Yeah,
I got 11 steps more to go.
Ooh, I'm a fiduciary. Saying fiduciary, just like the way it rolls off my tongue. So saying fiduciary is important because you are in fact a fiduciary. I'm a fiduciary. Advisors that work to the plans are fiduciaries, and everybody's held accountable to a certain set of rules. So how do you outsource or limit your risk or your liability? So you can choose to work with someone that's indemnified, that's a subject matter expert, and maybe will go on the document or even sign your 5500, which is your governmental filing of your plan, as your fiduciary, right? So now they're taking that risk because let's say they're putting that document together. You can outsource those tasks to them. It's totally compliant to do that. You're within your rights to do that. And I encourage most people to at least consider that. Oftentimes it's a very cheap insurance policy of sorts to have someone who just does that outsource those tasks. That's called a 316 administrator.
Okay.
So big deal. Specific to investments, you can outsource it to a 338, 3 sub 38. It's the code section in case it comes up on Jeopardy. Okay. It's got to, one of these days, this useless knowledge that I carry around, like your ridiculous knowledge of all things comics.
Cartoons, not comics. Very different.
That's Lula's the comics,
yeah,
right?
Comics,
yeah, comics, cartoons. So close to say.
Very different.
It will come up one day. It's going to come up. I'm going to know this question. That 338, you can outsource all your investment risk to someone who's going to pick and choose and monitor those funds and change them without your signing. And that's where most people get hung up. Well, wait a minute, my broker's going to pick and manage those funds. All right, well, your broker can do that if your broker's wearing the 338 hat. Your broker's not wearing a 338 hat and title and specifically indemnifying you for that risk, you're not indemnified.
So if I have a 338 and I have a 313, I still have risk.
316.
316, sorry. See, I would have lost on Jeopardy.
Yep.
So if I have a 338.
It's the Mr. Mom analogy, right? 220, 221, never takes.
So if I have a 338 and a 316, I still have risk as a fiduciary. Mm-hmm. So is there any way I can get rid of all my risk, or no? I'm always going to have some plan. Not have a plan. Okay.
Yep, not have a plan. Or you can entirely remove your plan. So let's say that your plan is not your plan. Your plan is maybe ADP or Paycheck's plan, right? And it's not your plan entirely. The only catch with that, and just to clarify this, because it comes up as a misnomer, I think lots of times, is when I'm fully out, that because someone else is having my plan, they're essentially someone else's staff, even though they're yours and you're running their wage and whatever, and the plan is totally outside, they're technically not indemnifying you or removing you from a task because they're saying, although you're in our plan, we are not considering ourselves your fiduciary. I don't know if that's ever going to stand up in a court of law, but
so in the case of a PEO, which is what you're talking about, I can maybe potentially remove myself from risk. I may still have a little bit of risk, but I could potentially remove myself. What about in a multi-employer plan? So if I'm in a multi-employer plan where my employees are part of a much larger plan, but they are still my employees. In a PEO environment, it's shared employees. In a multi-employer plan, they're my employees. So if they're my employees, can I eliminate risk through a multi-employer plan, or do I still now have the risk because they're still my employees?
You're definitely removing a lot of risk. You're never removing yourself entirely from that risk. Again, someone made a decision, I went with this PEO. Someone made the decision, I'm opting into this multiple employer opportunity. typically those MEPs, open MEP, closed MEPs, whatever they're using their term, however it works.
I like that. MEPs.
Yeah, that's cool, right? That also sounds pretty snazzy, right?
Yeah,
Multiple
MEPs.
employer plan. Sounds so cool. Such a jargon-laden industry. Makes you feel really knowledgeable when you walk in. Hey, how's your MEP?
She's fine. How's yours?
It's fantastic. So
thanks for asking.
it's good. It's about as good as this mic. It's right there. So typically when you're doing that, you're removing a lot of those tasks because the MEP is indemnifying you for that.
Yep. Okay. One of the other things you mentioned in your kind of top 5 list is you talked about having an investment policy.
So I think we skimmed through that one on the education policy statement. The investment policy statement, just like in the wealth management or private wealth management world, it should be, this is why we're choosing these funds. This is why we're reviewing them on a how often basis. How often we're willing to replace them and as necessary. When did we do that? How are we documenting that process? What's considered appropriate for our plan? So an investment policy statement for a defined contribution plan, like a 403B or 401k, would probably be a very different investment policy statement than it would be for a defined benefit plan, traditionally called a pension plan, where the employer is taking all the risk and making all the investment decisions because it's shooting for a certain target return every year.
One of the reasons I wanted to make sure I brought it up, though, is going back to our to-do list. Again, I find that a lot of organizations, they don't really have a formalized or documented investment policy. And that's, again, one of those things that they should be putting on their to-do list and saying, hey, we need to make sure that we have an investment policy. And then it shouldn't just be a document. Hey, we did it. We have an investment policy. But, how do we then monitor and follow and make sure that investment policy is being handled?
Well, investment policy statement, or IPS for short, is great because it holds each other accountable, right? So you're being assisted in the document creation by your consultants, your third-party administrator, maybe your investment advisor, or 338 is putting that together on your behalf, and now you're holding them accountable based on the document you jointly created.
Right. Okay. So going back and kind of taking us through this, I mean, we talked about the optimizing plan design. We talked about educational policy statements. We talked about investment policy statements. We talked about fiduciary. How come that's 4? Wasn't there a 5th one?
It's 5th, yeah. So it's right. You highlight that. See,
okay.
Running an RFP.
Oh, we have the RFP benchmark. So we did cover
that one.
Sorry.
The most important one.
Well, it's the one that we push out to our clients all the time. I mean, that's one of the things that we constantly talk about. And again, one of the things that you have with the benchmark is, and you kind of touched on it a little, but I think it's something that we should maybe talk a little bit more, is the fees. I mean, one of the issues that plans are running into is, the investment fees that they're being charged. And a lot of times those investment fees are obvious, and sometimes those investment fees are not as obvious. You want to talk a little bit?
Very hidden. That's true.
You want to talk a little bit about that and what plans should be doing, or what plan fiduciary should be doing in terms of looking at this stuff?
So when you're talking about that RFP benchmark, which again is covering a lot of things, let's just talk about the benchmark, because that's the quick and dirty version, which maybe just covers a little bit of the fees relative, again, to size or industry, or maybe both, size of the plan, number of staff, and maybe industry. When you're talking about that fee level, what are you really talking about? Well, most people think that their plan is free, or hey, I don't get an invoice from fill in the blank custodian, right? Whoever holds those assets. They never send us an invoice, so therefore our plan is free. Clearly, there is no free lunch on Wall Street. Those firms make plenty of profit, so there is clearly money being made. I don't think anyone wonders where that money comes from. But when you start pulling the layers back of the onion, you start realizing that there's a whole bunch of fees in there, hidden fees. In fact, now, of course, they would probably disagree that the fees aren't hidden because they're pushed out on what they call a 408B2 fee disclosure statement, which is another one of those useless, code sections that no one knows about. But also, it's not written in English. It's written in financial jargonese.
And it's not even financial jargonese.
I think it's Finglish.
Finglish, yeah.
Financial English. Yeah. So, and no one understands what it is. But buried in all that, if you could understand where it is, it explains all the fees. Well, still no one understands what it is because they put it in basis points. People understand that a basis point is a percentage of 1%.
Okay.
Right. So 0.01 is 1/10 of 1% of some number. People don't understand what that is because, again, we get back to that financial literacy. Part of doing good education could be just explaining to your staff how the plan works. But getting into the benchmark, why is it important to make sure that you're benchmarking your fees? Well, because if you don't know what the cost is of your plan, there's a good chance you're getting overcharged. Okay. You should absolutely know what it costs. You don't have to have the cheapest plan, but you should know who's getting paid what and what are they doing for it so you can hold people accountable.
So when you talk about then the benchmarking component, again, on our to-do list, if we determine what our fee structure is, we need to be able to document why that fee structure is appropriate given the service that we're receiving from the investment person we're working with.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. And when we look at those fees, again, it's not just the main fees that you see where you're cutting a check for those, but it's also the fees that maybe they're getting a commission on some of the funds.
Could be that, sure.
Okay.
And not even just the investment person, right? But maybe your third-party administrator who's doing the document review, the year-end testing, and the filing. That person could be part of that in the money calculation too. And then, of course, you've got the custodian, again, who's holding the money. Typically, they're the lion's share of that charge. What are they doing for that? Are you getting the best technology? Sometimes it's like driving an old car, having an old smartphone. Maybe it's even better, right? And not many people walking around with old iPhone 4s because the technology got better, the services got better. You can still have it, but why?
One of the things that you kind of see out there is that plans are still paying, and maybe it's appropriate, but they're paying a percentage of the investments. And I know that's come under a little fire lately in terms of a percentage of investment, because if I've got $10 million in a plan or $20 million in a plan, is the investment person or the plan administrator doing any more work for a $10 million plan or $20 million if both of them have the same number of employees? So we've seen a little bit more activity where it's no longer based on the number of assets, but maybe the number of participants within the plan and stuff. Is this a direction that you expect to see more of, or is it something that people should be exploring?
They should totally explore what it is. But again, the first step is knowing, right? Knowing what you have in your plan. Because sometimes clients have gone through and they've realized that there's not a lot of fat in it. Maybe it's priced really efficiently. They get no services because there's no fat in it. So no one's giving them any work because no one's making any money on it. So, sometimes it's the other way. It's not that everybody's getting, hosed. Sometimes your plan is ridiculously well priced and no one knew that. So, you're expecting something that you're not getting because there's nothing to have.
Right.
So it could be that the organization chooses to strip it down, like the example I'm giving. Let's just go lowest cost option, and then everything's a la carte, and we can really design, maybe through that education policy statement or whatever is appropriate for that organization. How often do we want to see the investment advisor? What do we expect our third-party administrator to do? What are we willing to outsource from a fiduciary task, and what should that service cost us versus what are we getting from it? And everything becomes a la carte at that point, and you know exactly what the fees are. So that comes. I would think that you're going to continue to see, a shrinking of fees, because it's just the way it is. Technology has been great at shrinking fees. Plus, hopefully, conversations like we're having now make people aware that whatever you have doesn't necessarily mean it's perfect. If you haven't pulled it apart, you don't know how you can make it get better.
Right. And again, I think knowledge is important. I think the more you kind of look at stuff, the more you kind of get an understanding of. There's a saying, you don't know what you don't know. The more you start informing yourself and you then dive into it, you're going to wind up with better results. You're going to wind up with better options. You're going to wind up with, a plan that really is more designed towards what you're looking for.
Absolutely.
So
couldn't have said it better myself.
Actually, that was what you wrote on the page. I'm just reading
I highlighted it 3 times. I'm glad you read that.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure.
You're welcome.
One of the things also that that we find a lot is that because we do a bunch of audits of plans, we constantly find errors within plans. We constantly find we constantly find errors within plans where the plan fiduciaries really don't have a real understanding of some basics, like what is the definition of compensation within the plan, or what constitutes making a timely remittance under a plan, and those types of things. You want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah. So when you're going through that audit or any kind of process like that, right? Oftentimes there's a whole lot of little things that people just would quickly overlook because compensation is compensation. We've even asked as a third-party administrator when we're doing year-end census work and we send it out and we collect the data back, and the data could be all the information that you need, right? The number of employees, their ages, the dates of birth, dates of hire, wages, the money they deferred, and we're truing that out to make sure that everything that was supposed to happen in the plan actually went into the plan. When it's trued out and it's actually happening, what you realize is this: they've only given you the people who are in the plan.
Okay.
Maybe they were misinformed prior to coming to work with us. It's everyone who's otherwise employed by you, whether they're deferring or not, whether they're in the plan or not, because that's important for the test. And there is ongoing discrimination tests, not my term, but that is the term from the DOL, which is to make sure that everybody's getting a fair shake and a fair opportunity to be a part of the retirement.
So it's not that everything is going to the owner of the company or the management of the nonprofit organization or whatever.
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
And I think the things you just highlighted are some of those, I would call it low-hanging fruit, just like some of the things we talked about today. Makes a material and substantial impact without a lot of calorie burn.
You know, what organizations don't understand is if they do something wrong, even if it was done unintentional, there's consequences, and they may have to make people whole. So we've seen instances where some employees got overfunded and some employees got underfunded, and you can't take the money away from the people who got overfunded to give to the people who got underfunded. You have to leave the money with the people who were overfunded and make the people who were underfunded whole.
Which employers don't really understand that, and they don't appreciate it when that happens.
But again, there's all of these components that have to think through and work through. So that's why it's important, even if you don't go through an audit, it might not be bad to have someone just look over the plan and make sure that you're in compliance, because that's really what a pension audit is. It's just really a big looking at, are we compliant with all the rules and regulations?
Checks and balances, right?
Because I can tell you that what we've seen is, we deal with a lot of different governmental agencies, and one of the worst ones to deal with is Department of Labor. And I'm sure you've dealt with the Department of Labor. And
good people, they have a good role to fill, right? So at the end of the day, so I don't want to have to deal with them any more than anyone else does. So we love our friends at the DOL. But the reality is they serve a purpose, right? So at the end of the day, they're out looking to make sure that employees are not getting screwed. And that's really important, right? So at the end of the day, they come in and they're coming in because someone's made a complaint. It doesn't have to be legit for them to come in and find something that maybe wasn't originally there. And that's, I think we both dealt with that with many clients, separate and joint, where clients unwillingly had an error. They screwed something up. And it happens, right? Because we're human and everybody makes mistakes like that as a plan sponsor. So part of that audit, whether you're forced into that audit based on the number of staff that you happen to have, eligible staff, which pushes you into that, or just an internal one that you run on your own because that's part of your fiduciary tasks, is to make sure this thing's being run right. There's a lot of ways of keeping yourself in the good graces of people like the DOL. You're just doing the right thing, right? Document a good process.
Yeah, the DOL has published reports, and it's amazing that they're based on their analysis, they find that more plans are non-compliant than are compliant. So it's kind of a scary thing. You're out there trying to do the right thing for as I said before, the right thing for your staff, and here you are opening yourself to a tremendous level of exposure, and you've got another governmental organization in essence kind of on your back looking at it, and they've come out and said that they expect you to be making mistakes because more often than not you do.
They say 80% of statistics are made up anyway, so I'm going to throw some more at you. But the gist of this is true, which is of plans that are $10 million in assets and higher that were audited by the Department of Labor, true stats now, almost 70% of them were found non-compliant in one or several areas. And typically it's not the things you'd think about, right? So it's not like, oh, wow, they must have had really expensive funds, or they didn't have enough funds, or they had, whatever, or too few funds. Typically it has nothing to do with the stuff that is right in your face. So people get that on their statement, right?
So what are the issues that are below the water, that big part of the iceberg that we're hitting?
Yeah, so it's a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, right? So it's maybe document driven. So they have a plan document. Your plan document is your governing instrument, right? It's the legal facility of you being able to have a plan and run that plan. So everything comes out of your document.
So I'm going to hold you there 1 second. I'll let you finish. So another thing to put on your to-do list is to review the plan document and actually making sure that you're complying with the plan document, and if it's the intentions of what you are trying to do.
Yeah, that's why someone's got to sit down with you and have these conversations, right? Because oftentimes when you and I are looking at plans from different perspectives, oftentimes you ask them questions, or you guys are coming in to do an audit, or we're inheriting a plan that we're taking over and helping try to improve. You're looking at what they did and you're looking at what they're supposed to have done. And sometimes those things don't jive. And the answer of, well, I don't know, that's the way it's always been, isn't really an answer that holds any water weight.
Right.
It also isn't logical to assume, and unfortunately this is the case for most organizations, that they put someone who's well-meaning in their firm to remit the money, right? To take the money from payroll that's been left in the organization's account and push it to the custodian record-keeping firm that's, again, holding the money. That's the term that we're using here, and allocate it to, so Mark gets 10 and Ken gets 100 and Christina gets 1,000. We like how we did that. Since she's got the mic and the thing, she can make me look really handsome in the camera.
I'm sorry, I don't think
1,000.
I don't
That's
think she has the
impossible,
ability.
I know. I thought they had great technology nowadays, not so
No.
much. Put a mustache on, they look fantastic. So, but to make sure that that person's doing that job, and typically that person in the firm is not the the person that understands the plan, because they're not privy to all those conversations. They're just some well-meaning employee doing a daily task or weekly task or whatever it is to do this, not realizing that A, that they're fiduciary, or B, that they're not compliant with the plan.
And there's a time frame that they have to remit and everything else.
Sure.
So what are the other, you started saying, and then I cut you off, but what are the other, which I do all the time, my wife complains about that, but what are those things that are kind of underneath the surface, those iceberg type things? You started to say some examples of what some of those iceberg
So a
type
lot of
things
it's
are.
just procedural, right? So a lot of it is tying together all of the things. So when you guys come in and do an audit, you're asking them, hey, what's your checks and balances, right? Often it's, and I know because we've given you guys a lot of stuff for clients that we've had together, and you ask a really exhaustive list. Hey, let's get the document, let's get the summary plan description, what's been going out to the staff, when was the last time you did this, have you done that? And it's this big long litany of things, right? Then it's the internal process. How often is that money separated from the employee's wage? How quickly is it remitted? Who's truing it up? Are there loans? Loans are a big to-do. Distributions. Who authorized the distribution? Did that person get their money out of the plan before the match was made? Is there still dribbles of money left that the employees maybe have, and they can't find these employees, but they keep them in the plan? Maybe you have a bigger employer, and we have lots that have that 100+ employees. They've got some substantial turnover, maybe seasonal folks. They come and they go, and they're left with balances. Maybe they're under 1,000 or between 1,000 and 5. You can clean those people up, and no one has. Provisions in the plan, but no one's done it.
Right.
It can cause a lot of issues.
Okay. One of the other things that, we see out there is forfeitures. So you have, and you said before, there are different vesting schedules that you can establish for employees, in the nonprofit.
Serious knowledge right now.
Sorry.
I don't really
have any. Thanks, boo-boo. Anyway, I don't really have a lot of real knowledge. Like I said, I'm taking good notes from you. But in terms of those forfeitures, what you see a lot of times is that, you have different vesting and you have these forfeitures that get created. Now, is there a requirement to use the forfeitures within a certain amount of time? What should people be doing with these forfeitures? Because sometimes we see them accumulating.
I like that, right? So forfeitures are something that are typically misunderstood. So forfeiter is money that's
there's a lot of things. I'm often misunderstood too. So I consider myself a
Ken
forfeiture.
Forfeiture Cerini. KF. So
and I make chicken too.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah,
so
awesome.
I like that. So tie that in. Right? It's chicken and rib night at the Palace Hotel Ballroom. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk forfeitures now, which is money that's been in the plan that maybe somebody left, right? So Mark was in the plan. He got a contribution in that year, and he never vested or earned the money that was contributed into his account by the employer. Didn't stay a long enough period of time. I leave, I take my piece with me, I take whatever the employer's, and then there's some residual money that's in that plan. That money is a plan asset. So what often happens, we talked about some of that stuff that lies below the waterline. It's not uncommon that many employers will think, mistakenly so, that Mark was working for me at one time, he left before the contribution needs to be made, and I don't need to make anything on his behalf. That's not true, because if I earned it even while I was there, even if I'm not going to get it after I've already left, the money is still responsibility and a liability to the plan. It's got to go in. That money becomes a forfeiture. Okay. Right? So it's just residual money that's left in this plan. So what can you do with forfeiture money? Well, you could reduce your contribution as an employer to your current year, right?
So that'll reduce the amount I have to put into the plan. And I could give it out to other employees.
Let's say that you're supposed to put $50,000 into the plan, and there was a $10,000 forfeiture. So you could do, right, 50 minus 10, you have 40,000 that you can now put in. You could use that forfeiture money to reduce your current year.
You do that math stuff well.
It's nice. Big numbers. Polish, I'm right on this. So you can also use that money to pay for plan-related expenses. Let's say that in that example, we said we're separating out all these different billables. I have an audit fee. I have a third-party administrator fee, for example. I could use some of those forfeitures to pay those outside vendors for doing plan-related work.
Okay. And I mean, can I just hold it in the plan, forfeitures?
You could.
Or is there a specific amount of time that I have to? Yeah.
So no, so that there is no force that you have to do something with the forfeitures. I think as a prudent plan person, as we all are, you would want to use something for that money because that money's been contributed to the plan. It's
Okay.
not common, especially in nonprofits, that they're so flush with cash that they shouldn't be looking to use the money that's maybe left in their plan to reduce current year contributions.
Okay.
For-profit organizations are typically different. Maybe they're looking for the tax break. They could be using it, but by not making a bigger contribution, they're paying more in tax. So maybe there's a logic there.
Well, on the nonprofit side also, you got to also understand how you're funded, because if
sure.
I'm an organization that's funded for on a fee for service basis, then yeah, by all means, I want to utilize the forfeitures to reduce my contributions. But if I'm a nonprofit organization that's cost based, so that I'm getting funded for my costs, if I use forfeitures, I'm reducing my costs. So you could have a similar circumstance in the nonprofit sector as you do in the for-profit world.
Absolutely.
So again, I think it comes down to kind of what makes sense for the organization.
We've covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we have in a relatively short period of time.
That's good.
Yeah. Well,
does that mean we need to stretch? Do we need to go through more material?
Let's go through more
love
material. Go for it.
That's good. So we talked about 5 things, right? So what are the stuff that we didn't talk about that maybe is something else that should be top of mind?
Go ahead.
So one of the things I think, and we talked about this a little bit, so let's expand it as a break-off point. Talking about environmentally, socially conscious investments, right? So that comes up a lot for nonprofits, right? Because typically they're out there doing good by the public, right? Hence why they get their unique status and making Long Island, for example, another better place. Maybe they're inclined to use maybe very particular types of mutual fund investments inside their plan. So what I mean, let's say that maybe they have certain religious beliefs or that they have certain social beliefs, and they don't want to have any mutual funds that maybe invest in, I don't know, pornography or guns or tobacco or something like that.
Okay.
That's an area that obviously you and I are going to talk about a lot more on May 10th. That's considered a shout out, I think, again.
Yeah, it's another.
Shameless marketing plug.
May 10th. Come to the event.
It's a good event. So, but we also want to make sure that just in terms of putting those in, again, it's a fiduciary responsibility. How did you vet that particular fund or type of fund? You can't just throwing funds into your plan for all of your employees to be eligible to use if there's not some reason why you're putting them in there. And the reason can't just be, hey, this organization has this really deep-seated belief that you shouldn't have this or that. There's nothing wrong with having them, but again, it's still responsible for you as a fiduciary to make sure that it's in compliance with your investment policy statement, that someone's watching these things, that it's just not, you're not just checking the box for maybe yourself or your board that you wanted to put these types of plans.
If you do limit the options, does that create more fiduciary responsibility for you, because now you're not providing the full broad spectrum of possible investment opportunities?
So it used to be that there was very few fund options, right? Because a 401k hasn't been around that long, 403b not that long either. You don't want to have so many funds, and the list of funds used to be 25 plus available options. That was the average. That's a lot for people to digest, especially when they don't have a lot of financial literacy in terms of vetting their own fund choices, picking a fund, building a portfolio out of the random funds. The government made some pretty intelligent decisions as it related to retirement plans, which is to push out target date funds. Target date funds are a date-driven fund where someone could go in at whatever date is closest to. Let's say I'm going to retire in 2040. I keep throwing that out. Maybe that's good. Speak it into existence. So if I'm going to retire in 2040, I could put 100% of my money in my plan in that 2040 fund, and it's going to manage my money from now all the way to my targeted retirement age, 2040 hypothetically, and maybe 25 or 30 years past. So they put these plans together, and the mutual fund companies came out with some great funds at low cost to put those in there. Target date funds are one of those check the box options that if you have them as part of your plan, typically they only take up one spot because it's the entire series of funds. And it removes a lot of fiduciary liability from you because your employees can pick one fund instead of trying to build something themselves with little knowledge.
You mentioned they're a type of mutual fund. And so you have different options when you're purchasing a plan or setting up a plan. Some organizations go to insurance companies and they're working with, let's say, variable annuities.
They have units versus shares.
Yep. And then you have some that go to more independent type brokers who are working with mutual funds. Can you talk for a couple minutes or about a half a minute on what the difference between those are and why one's better than the other, or is it one better than the other?
It's not that one's better than the other. So in the beginning, In the beginning, there was man, and then there was woman, and then we had a full moon.
So and then a belly button.
Yeah, we still got to get on that theory. It's a fantastic theory if we've got some more time. But in the beginning, right, 403Bs particularly, they were mostly insurance-driven contracts, meaning they came from, let's say, an ING or TIAA-CREF or something else where they were insurance-wrapped contracts. So they had some uniquely particular programs to them, maybe a higher fixed account rate because they were part of a bigger insurance contract. So you couldn't look at your mutual fund, your investments. I keep saying mutual fund. You shouldn't look in your investments on your statements and pull up the newspaper or online and find where they were because they were part of a insurance-driven contract.
Okay.
That was the original ones. Typically, those were higher fees because that was the only option available for 403Bs. 403Bs and 401Ks are very similar in terms of options now. So you have those more robust, more a la carte type options that you alluded to before now, where you're not stuck working with only insurance companies. You can go to wherever you'd like, have a full option menu of whatever the lowest cost funds are, best performing, target dates, environmentally, socially conscious types investments, and whatever else makes people happy inside of one contract and really get the best of all worlds. So you're not limited to, you can have any color as long as it's black. You can pick whatever you'd like now.
Okay. We're down to probably our last 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah. So soon?
Yeah, so soon.
Anyway,
just
getting good at this.
If somebody were looking to reach you, how would they go about doing that?
This is when we flashed it up on the screen. No.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're based in Hop Hog. So me and my 15 staff are great people, all trying to do the right thing by our clients. Right here in Hop Hog. So it's Magii, Magii-Inc.com or 631-434-8200.
And if you want to maybe give a 2-second summarization of what we talked about today, what should people be taking away from today?
Yes, I think you covered a lot of talking points, but I think the top 5 were really important. So know that there is a lot of ways to improve your plan to accomplish the goals and remove yourself from a lot of risk by just doing some basic things, right? Looking at an RFP or a benchmark, putting into effect a really good, efficient plan design review, which is looking at your plan specifics in your document, having an education policy statement, having an investment policy statement, and understanding who's a fiduciary, what the fees and provisions are in your plan, and understanding who's doing what. And that's absolutely something you should be doing at least once every 3 years.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks for all the knowledge that you partake on, everybody.
Thanks
your
for
work. Our next webinar is Thursday, May 16th at noon, like always. We're going to have David Goldstein from Sir Tillman Ballin coming in. He's going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of nonprofit governance. Until then, see ya.